Well, first of all, Charles, thank you for introducing me, and I'm very fortunate today that there's a whole group, in addition to Alison, who of course has a particular pride of place on the panel, given the wonderful clip of the movie that we saw. And the purpose of this panel is, as Charles said, to talk a bit about not the co-benefits associated with addressing climate change, but almost for 1 hour, if we have your permission, to reverse the narrative a little bit. And to reverse the narrative deliberately in the sense of treating actions to reduce carbon emissions potentially as the co-benefit of other actions that are in fact all around delivering better water outcomes, better energy outcomes, better land use outcomes, better biodiversity outcomes. In fact, what we, at least in our language, describe as better resource productivity. And the thesis that we're going to explore in different ways over the course of the panel is whether this idea of resource productivity, delivering, if you will, more economic growth and better economic outcomes, as well as can actually meet the environmental and climate challenges at the same time, or whether are we kind of, in some sense, too much trying to have our cake and eat it and kind of kidding ourselves. And in fact, there's a tougher conversation that, with honesty, we need to have about the underlying narrative of growth, which sits probably for all of us in the business community as one of our central beliefs. Now, you will have heard a number of references to this report called Resource Revolution. There is a 250-page version of this, which I'm very happy to make sure is available to anybody who would like a copy. The only thing you have to do is to give me a business card, and I'll make sure it's sent through to you. I've brought a dozen or so copies of the executive summary with me. But let me just take 1 minute before introducing the panel to give you the kind of the central proposition. And then I'm going to hand it over and allow everybody in their own different ways to explore elements of that proposition. And for us, the starting point in the inquiry is deliberately the markets and what's going on in the world economy. And what is taking place in the world economy right now, and has been over the last decade or so, is a tremendous, tremendous growth in the number of people who we might regard as middle-class consumers. And the press in the last month or so has been alive with the fact that we have now got 7 billion people living on the planet, and it's an important milestone in its own way. There's a different exploration that this report covers, which is the fact that over the last 25 years, roughly 1 billion people, not 7, but 1 billion people, have joined, if you will, the middle classes of the world, and are able to consume with the footprint, I'm afraid, of the middle classes in all the different resources. Over the next 25 years, we won't be adding 1 billion people of middle-class consumption patterns, but irrespective almost of what goes on in Europe and with the euro and the short-term phenomena, we will be adding 2.5 to 3 billion additional middle-class consumers into the demand pattern of the world economy. And one way or another, that's going to have a massive, massive structural effect. Right? The reason why, for all the wonderful, wonderful projects and programs and initiatives that are talked about in meetings like this at Durban, and were talked about at Cancun, and were talked about at Copenhagen, and before, all these meetings and all these projects and carbon emissions are still rising. Right? And they're rising because we have built a world economy that is designed to meet these growing middle-class consumption patterns on the basis of energy and resource-intensive models of supply. So what we've tried to do in the McKinsey report is to address this. And our thesis, which I hope some of you will take the time to read, is that in fact, there is an opportunity, if we focus on the right resource productivity opportunities, to not only have the growth that we want, but also to do so in a way that delivers a massive economic prize that we estimate to be worth up to $3 trillion a year. It delivers a huge environmental prize in that we do think there is a pathway, if you will, to 450, which may or may not be climate safety, but it's a damn sight better than the pathway we're on at the moment, and which has enormous benefits for the poor, just enormous benefits for the poor. And almost everything that you will read in the report, all the opportunities from building efficiency to food waste, to better use of high quality steel, to smallholder farm yields, to improved approaches to water management. Over 70% of the opportunities that we've identified that can actually help us deal with the dilemma are ones that return over 10% for the private sector. And you may or may not care about that, but in a business for environment meeting where we're talking about mobilizing capital at vast scale, we need to be able to generate returns that are compatible with the needs of the private sector investors, who in the end, for the most part, will turn out to be the institutions that underpin pension funds across the world. So I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to turn to you, Alison, first, because you've had a kind of half a shot already. But I am going to ask, if it's okay, Steve, for you to take the first shot at this. Steve Lennon, I'm sure all of you have the program notes, but is I'm going to get this right, the Divisional Executive for Corporate Services at ESCOM is how it's described here. But actually, Steve, I've known Steve for a number of years now, and actually, of the people coming from the energy utility sector who have a point of view about what it means to tackle the real issues of delivering the energy requirements of a growing population at the same time as meeting kind of the goal of efficiency and the goal of cleaner energy. Steve will tell you the real issues and the real story. So let me start by asking you to tell it as you see it.
Thanks, Jeremy. I thought I would start by just sharing with you what it is that we're doing in South Africa in the power sector, and obviously ESCOM being a state-owned enterprise in the power sector is a key implementer there. South Africa has stated a very clear intention of changing gear as far as climate change is concerned. We said that in Copenhagen with our aspiration to essentially ensure that our emissions peaked in around about 2020, then plateaued for a period, and then declined in real terms. And the question then is that if this is your aspiration, and if you're getting the majority of your emissions coming from the power sector, which is primarily driven by coal, well then how does that aspiration then get translated into actions in the power sector? Well, and then how do you turn that into the kind of opportunities that you're talking about, Jeremy, that to leverage that for economic growth and development, etc. So what has been done, as we're saying, is that South Africa is basically going to fundamentally shift the base of the power sector away from coal. And what we're doing in ESCOM is we're doing that in three different ways. The first one is the reduction of our existing carbon footprint. So that's through internal energy efficiency. It's making existing coal plants more efficient. It's putting photovoltaic systems on existing coal sites, looking at biomass co-firing, and a whole lot of different innovations. The second one is energy efficiency in the entire customer base in South Africa. And this is where one of the messages that we try and get across is that we must get used to working in a resource-scarce future, and that resource includes energy as a very precious and increasingly expensive resource. And so to fundamentally change the appreciation of the value of energy in society is one of the goals that we have. And that is not just to deal with it technologically, and you can do that. We've replaced 47 million light bulbs with compact fluorescent light bulbs. We have a solar water heating program that replaces electric water heating with solar water heating. We have programs with industry whereby we promote the use of efficient motors and drives and heat pumps and things like that. But it's also about capturing the hearts and minds of people in such a way that they will reduce their use of energy and basically make the South African economy more efficient. because we are generally an energy-intensive economy. And that is not just about technology, it's also about behavior. And then the third element is our future investments. Minimizing coal in our future energy mix, maximizing the role of renewables, maximizing the role of nuclear, imported hydro, and natural gas, which will mean that by 2030, the emissions from the power sector in South Africa would have reduced by 34% in relative terms. The question then is that how do you get a development dividend out of that? And you can invest in infrastructure and create very few jobs, or you can invest in infrastructure with a focus on localization, with a focus on job creation, with a focus on skills development, and you can get a massive development, economic development and social development dividend from that. And that's exactly what the South African government is working on at the moment as part of its green growth strategy. So if we look at, for example, at the moment, the massive investments that we're making, currently sitting on around about 400 billion South African rands, and we are creating in the process tens of thousands of jobs and building local manufacturing. I think that at the same time, we must always be aware that in this resource-scarce future is that in South Africa, we have to do a lot more to adapt to the negative impacts of climate change. And there's also a technology and a behavior element. The behavior element is about efficiency. The technology element, for example, on the water side is about using dry cooling. It's about building our water supply infrastructure, but also for Eskom, it's about designing our transmission infrastructure to cater for more extreme weather events and making sure that our coastal facilities are resilient in the face of more active sea and sea level rise and more wave activity, etc. The ultimate goal must be emissions-free growth. And in South Africa, I think that the fact that we are an energy-intensive economy creates an enormous opportunity. And that is to grow our economy without necessarily growing our emissions. And I think we'll be able to do that. There's a final point that I want to make, and that is that there also has to be a universal access dividend that comes out of this. At the moment in South Africa, we've moved from less than 30% access to electricity in South Africa in 1994 to around about 80% today. But there's still a 20% gap, which equates to between 2.5 and 3.5 million households that don't have access to electricity. We can give them that access at a very, very small increment in emissions, but with a massive increment in quality of life, in improved education, in improved health, in improved security, you name it, that energy access has got a massive dividend. And we aim to do that whilst at the same time growing into a much lower emissions future for South Africa. Thanks, Jeremy.
So, Steve, I'll stop you there. I'm going to come back because it all sounds too good to be true at some level. And we're going to tackle, if we have time, one or two, what makes all this so damn difficult. Scott, can I turn to you next? We spend a lot of time on energy systems. We spend less time than we should on agricultural and land use systems. And I know that your company is right at the heart of thinking about different approaches, if you will, to the application of technology in the agricultural sector. Can you give us in 3 or 4 minutes what you see, what's the opportunity, right, in terms of a better model of agricultural production that delivers both the, improved performance in terms of food and feed, but also some improved environmental characteristics? And what's the one thing that's stopping you from playing that out?
All in 3 minutes.
All in 3 minutes, because I'm looking for time productivity
there we go.
As well as resource productivity.
Again, I appreciate the opportunity to be part of the panel and discuss the challenges and opportunities we're going to have to work together to bringing business forward in a world where population is growing quickly, water shortages are becoming more and more of an issue, or supply and resource issues are becoming more of a problem. Historically, I'll give you a little history on ag, because I don't know that everyone in this arena understands ag or has been engaged with it. Most of ag in the past has really been focused on maximizing productivity. As we go forward, I think we're going to have to look at it more holistically. The way we look at it, and the industry in a whole is starting to look at it more as, you have to take into account things like productivity, animal well-being, environment, food safety. All of those things have to be equated. If one gets out of kilter, that's where you can start getting into issues that you could be going down a path that may not be sustainable long term. What we're looking at, what we see, a couple facts to think about from food production is, we do have today, or in 20 years, or in 40 years, another 2 billion people are going to be on the earth. 2 billion more, as you talked about, will be in the middle class. Their consumption is going to go up. Today, approximately 70% of all the water that's withdrawn goes to agriculture on average. In some parts of the world, India, for example, and here in Africa, 95% of the water that's withdrawn goes to agriculture. That's probably not sustainable. 40 years ago, and most of our feed is based on corn and soybeans. 40 years ago, the U.S. produced 50% more corn than they needed. Today, they can produce about 5% more. So we're going to have to look at things differently. We're going to have to do things significantly in a different way. Today, we do have enough food to feed the world. Our problem today is more some of the trade barriers and other issues we deal with to get the food where it needs to be. In developing countries, a third of all the food is lost before it gets to the kitchen table. In developed countries, a third of the food is wasted after it gets to the kitchen table. So if we can work on logistics and connect our trade barrier, or eliminate trade barriers and the whole infrastructure, you can address that. But going forward, that becomes where we have some concerns. Norman Borlaug, who was the father of the Green Revolution, made an interesting statement, and actually I heard Jason Clay use it about two weeks ago. In the next 40 years, we're going to have to produce the same amount of food that we have produced in the last 8,000 years. Now think about that statement. 40 years to produce the same amount of food we produced in the last 8,000 years. We can't do it based on what we have today. We're going to have to continue to look at technologies and adopt technologies and things that's going to allow us to drive forward. One thing I find interesting is, as the human race, we absolutely love and embrace technology. Think about probably all the tweets and everything else that's going on here today, and all the technologies I've heard for all day long about what these new technologies are going to allow us to achieve the reduced carbon footprint. 20 years ago, I don't know if you all remember this, some of you are probably, I'm older than most of y'all, I think. The big issue with cell phones, does everybody remember what the big issue with cell phones was going to be? We're all going to get brain cancer from using cell phones. Does anybody remember that? I don't think that's happened. But we have gotten past that and realized we need these kind of technologies. Probably the biggest thing that we in agriculture are facing going forward, our number one issue is going to be water resources. And you need to look at types of technologies that allow us to grow things in areas right now that have drought issues. For example, here in South Africa, drought is, water shortage is an issue. Corn varieties, native corn varieties here in Africa produce about 1.5 tons per acre. Corn varieties in the US can produce about 10 tons per acre, excuse me, not per acre, per hectare. Do we need to go to 10 tons? Possibly not. But what we have to do is how do we continue to increase the top end, but bring the lower end up so we can improve that overall efficiency and reduce the carbon footprint at the same time. So, I mean, those are the important things that we're looking at. Is water usage or shortage is going to be important, but our biggest issue that we're dealing with is accepting technologies that's going to allow us to feed the world and at the same time preserve the environment. That's the biggest one.
Let's stop it there, because what's interesting is from both from both Steve and Scott, what we've heard is that what used to, in some sense, be a simple problem, produce more electricity however you could, produce more food however you could, has now become a much more complex problem. Right? Because we need to solve out for multiple goals at the same time. Right? We want to solve out for environment. We want to solve out for, forms of resilience, right? Universal acts. So they're much broader, if you will, kind of objective function. Often the way we solve for these more complex problems is we bring IT to bear, right? Sometimes IT makes the problem even more complicated. So I'd like to turn next to Chris. And Chris heads up environmental initiatives at HP. And it will be good, and in one sense, I think we all know that making all the systems, the resource systems, smart is part of the answer. Right? It would be good to get from you a sense of where are we making progress on making things smart, and where are we not making progress? And you have 3 minutes.
Great. I will try to do that. Thank you, Jeremy, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. I want to return to some comments that were made by a previous panelist, because like Ericsson at HP, we believe the IT industry can play a pivotal role in optimizing the use of natural resources, in particular energy and raw materials, and I'll explain how we can do that. The good news then is that as an industry we're reasonably aligned. The not so good news is that the preceding panelist took a couple of my points. But I think one of the key things that he talked about was connectivity and the revolution in connectivity that's happened in developing markets and developed markets, and how that's going to spread to developing markets increasingly in the future. And it will be a source of economic growth as it does that. So the 3 billion people that will enter the middle class by 2030 will be a connected middle class wherever they are in the world. And what that means really is that, and what didn't really get discussed in the previous panel, is the fact that that's going to mean that data needs are going to continue to grow exponentially. And I think what we recognize at HP is that if we try to meet those data needs with the solutions of the present, it's not going to be sustainable. The data point about 2% and 98% has been used a number of times, and in fact, we were discussing it in the pre-panel session before we came in here. And unfortunately, the IT industry has not delivered against those numbers, and in fact, the 2% has continued to grow. So we really need to put the brakes in place in order to reverse that, and also to begin to tap the potential of IT to impact the business processes of other companies. So to answer your question, Jeremy, what can be done, what's working, what's not working, I think the important thing is that HP, as the world's largest IT company, sees that we have an extreme responsibility to be able to deliver against that vision of the 2 and the 98, for want of a better term. We've got 4 different ways that we're going to go about doing that, and we can maybe discuss those and debate those further as we go forward. One is by making better use of available energy, as Steve said, by continuing to make our existing products more energy efficient. And I'll just give one example of that. Just recently we announced something called Project Moonshot. That's because we're aiming high. Get it? Project Moonshot, to put it more seriously, is a new server technology that uses the chips that are in your cell phones and tablet devices as the base of the server processing. Compared with servers of the same size and speed, Project Moonshot is 90% more energy efficient. That's 90. So you can imagine a data center filled with Project Moonshot servers being able to process that exponentially higher amount of data that we're going to need to be connected in the future to continue to drive economic growth, being a much more efficient data center than any that we have today. And there are many other examples of things that we're doing at HP in order to make our existing products more energy efficient. The second way that we're looking at realizing the promise of the 2 and the 98 is by innovating new business processes for our customers. And again, one example that I would cite is the move from analog to digital printing. Analog printing has a number of inherent inefficiencies. It means you have to run large print runs in order to get cost-effective amounts of paper. It means that you need to print the materials and ship them to a distribution point. It means that they need to be stored. I mean, there's all sorts of issues with analog printing. And digital printing, if it were to replace that kind of conventional analog approach, could save significant amounts of carbon if coupled with responsible paper sourcing. So this is something that we've been working on. We have the HP Indiglo printing press, which is able to print books in real time and on demand, and at the point of distribution rather than many miles away. Thirdly, I think we need to take a life cycle approach to the issue, and we need to work across the entire life cycle with our partners in the supply chain and in the end of life. Because if we're going to be a connected society in the future, there's going to be a proliferation of devices, and those devices need to be redeployed. So, you know, we've been doing a lot of great work around the world in recycling printer cartridges, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with that. We've reached the closed loop in many of our markets with our printer cartridges, but we're also working hard to make that process work in terms of e-waste. And as prices of gold and other precious metals continue to increase, e-waste becomes a valuable commodity in and of itself. And in fact, we have a couple of pilot programs here in Africa which are beginning to deal with the issue of e-waste on the ground in developing markets in a pioneering way.
So do you mind if I stop you there?
Absolutely, that's fine.
Because we've got three great ideas. Yep. I want to give time to the others.
Sure.
But it's another area of where the business model itself becomes more complex.
Indeed.
Right? And more data intensive, and the circularity requires you to retain control of the, if you will, the materials throughout the life cycle and back again.
And if I can just add one thing, I mean, what it also calls upon is a greater level of collaboration than we've ever had
across
before.
Value chains.
Across value chains, with partners, with customers, in order to be able to deliver against that vision.
Now we're going to break tradition at this point, because the normal tradition is that we then go to the fourth business person, and then we go to the NGO representative at the end, and she tells us all that we're not doing a good enough job and we're all kidding ourselves, right? So we're not going to do that. We're going to go to Samantha now, right? And then we'll come to Alison, and you can bookend us because you started us in a way. So Sam, you've heard 3 or 4 kind of descriptions of actions that are being taken, the technological opportunity, the transformation in the energy sector, how IT can help, you know, yet more analysis from McKinsey. Are we just kind of kidding ourselves here because we're not actually addressing the root cause of the problem? Or are we beginning to get to grips with the environmental issue in a way that actually can mobilize the required private capital and innovation at the scale that will be needed? What's your, you've listened to the whole day, so, you know, kind of what's your, how would you see, how are we doing?
Well, unfortunately, I have not listened to the whole day, but only parts of it. But I have listened to the presentations we just had. So I think we've touched on the core issue, which is that in 2050, we'll be 9 billion people on the planet. And we have to find a way to bring food, water, and energy to all of those people, and at the same time, still have some space for nature, not break our natural resource base. So that's a huge challenge. So what I hear as I've listened to your presentations is I hear the start of thinking about how we're going to do that. What you said, Jeremy, about a multi-benefit approach as opposed to a single goal approach. So not just bringing down emissions, but also increasing energy access, not just increasing productivity, but also trying to do that in a way that you know, respects land use, and also finally the IT industry, which I think for many of us is really an example of how we can do much, much more with much, much less. Right? That many of the kinds of solutions that you bring to your clients, that they're actually reducing emissions in a huge way by more than 80% in some cases. But also, as we discussed before we got started, and I think this is where you'd like me to go, Jeremy,
We go exactly where you want to go, Samantha.
As always. We haven't really touched on the core issue. And the core issue is that when we know that we're heading towards 9 billion people, can those 9 billion people, can those 3 billion new consumers, new middle-class consumers who are going to come into the economy in the next decade or so, mostly from Asia, can they consume at the same rate and in the same way that people are consuming in the developed countries? And then the other question, or you could flip it around and say, can people in the developed world continue to consume at the same pace in the same way when others are coming in and filling that space in the market? And the other very fundamental question is, what are the connections between growth, development, and emissions? Because we have a model in many parts of the world, let's just take the developed world, where economic growth is essential both for the political survival of governments, but also for the commercial survival of companies. And we are facing a situation, certainly in the Eurozone, where we're not likely to see economic growth for a while, right? And so the big question, maybe Europe is going to be a testing ground, is whether continued high quality of life, which I think we can all agree people certainly enjoy in Europe, whether that can in any way decouple from economic growth. And what about even a scenario of degrowth, which you're going to see in a few European countries, at least in the short term? Now, as WWF, we don't exactly have a position on growth, but I think I could probably say it this way. I mean, certainly a kind of growth that does not involve doing more with less, a kind of growth that involves sort of infinite expansion of extraction of natural resources, that doesn't use life cycle approaches, that doesn't use reuse and recycling, that kind of growth we are not for. And we're certainly also not for a one-size-fits-all approach to growth. So, for example, we're in a country that needs to grow its economy in order to lift people out of poverty, in order to create jobs and improve the quality of people's lives. But there are other parts of the world where this might not be necessary. I'll round off and just remind us all of the work of a Swedish statistician named Hans Rosling, who's one of my favorites in the development area. And what's interesting about his work is that he reminds us in some of it of the fact that economic growth is not always tightly linked to development indicators. So for example, some Latin American countries do very well on biodiversity conservation, they do pretty well on emissions, but they also do quite well on poverty alleviation and development indicators. And in fact, some of those countries even do better on, for example, healthcare and human health indicators than the United States, even though their GDP per capita is lower. And there's something in that Latin American paradox, if I can call it that, from which perhaps we could learn. The other thing, I think, just from a climate perspective, is that if we're talking about reaching 50 to 80% emissions reductions by 2050, which is what the science says, so there's really no question about this, then we're going to have to go beyond incremental improvements to energy systems, incremental improvements to agriculture, incremental improvements to business models. It's not going to be enough to increase your energy efficiency, to add 10 or 20% of renewable energy. We're going to have to do much, much more radical things. And that there are going to be winners in that transition, and maybe we see a couple of them on this panel today, but there will also be losers. There will be companies whose business models no longer work in a low-carbon world. I can't look into the future and say what all of those will be, but I think that any company that is spending a certain amount of its R&D capital and its human capital on thinking about this issue of what does my business model look at 80% emissions reductions, that is a company that's very likely to be successful in the future. Thank you.
Sam, thank you. Now, Alison, if I may turn to you. I think everybody who watched the clip must have been moved and inspired by what you managed to create. And I think what will be interesting is kind of just for, again, 3 minutes, the backstory. What motivated this? Was this driven off, if you will, just what you saw as a great business opportunity and how do we get it funded? Or was it somehow cooked up in the CSR department first, and then it moved from the CSR and it crept its way into some kind of, new business development unit? I think many, many companies are trying to figure out how to get exactly the kind of opportunities and to go after them in the way that that you've done so successfully. So give us a little bit of the backstory, and in the 1 minute on the top of that, what do you guys do next? What do you do to make this not just a one-off, but that is something that you do, 100 times over?
Sure, thanks. The video clip did make this talk a lot easier for me because it sets the context of the perspective that I bring, I think, to the panel, which is slightly separate than what we've heard so far. But just to give you some background on how the project came to life, was our Vestergaard Fransen is a disease control textile company that really looks at how do you do good in the world and do business at the same time, that they're not mutually exclusive. And a problem we face in public health and development is how do you create sustainable change that within the populations that are most vulnerable in the world. And you run into issues with traditional development aid there. Those are volatile funding streams. They're usually for 3 to 5 years at a time. If you're looking at water management or access to safe drinking water, you can't achieve sustainable health impact or change on a 3 to 5 year project. So this came out of how do we rethink an innovative finance solution to achieve sustainable development. And we looked at carbon finance as a piece of that. One of the challenges I think we face that directly ties into the question of resource productivity and consumption is when we hear all these great solutions to resource productivity, we're talking about how much impact we can make on these 3 billion people that are coming into the middle class. But you can see in this example that you can actually achieve significant impact on individual household level interventions. But that assumes, I think what we need to be careful about is assuming we're starting from the same baseline here. How do we measure the baseline of resource consumption? Because the way it's traditionally done in carbon markets and with climate initiatives is you look at large polluting areas, charcoal plants, you then allow them access to carbon finance to implement new, more productive approaches, more clean technologies, and you achieve significant impact that way. But if you look at the most vulnerable populations in the world, developing countries, all over Africa, poverty is a huge barrier to resources and to resource consumption. And so they're not starting at the same baseline and level. They don't have the same access to markets as the rest of the world. So you'll see a project like this, and then you hear the statistic that only 3% of carbon finance projects are in Africa. You realize that there is a misalignment in how we recognize baseline resources and baseline resource consumption.
So now I'm conscious of time, and so what I would suggest we do, it's quite hard to see who's got questions out there in the audience, but I'd be keen to open it up right now and I'd encourage you to, in a sense, ask people about the backstories or about what's difficult. Why are we having these wonderful ideas, but where is it that we're struggling to scale them, right? Whether it's because of baselines, because of competing objectives, right, that must sit within ESCOM. I cannot believe that it's a straightforward kind of everybody's aligned perfectly on the right investment program and the way in which one should play it forward. So can I encourage people to, I may be wrong about that at ESCOM.
No, you're not. No.
But can I encourage people to dig a little bit for the next 10, 15 minutes? Anybody out there? Because if not, pardon? And it's getting late. So I am gonna just ask a couple of questions to the panel, if that's all right, and then I'm going to wrap for the day, right? So by giving everybody one last minute. So can I start, Chris? I've done a whole bunch of work recently on this whole closed loop model, and there are wonderful one-off examples of how we capture the e-waste and we capture the printer cartridge and we recycle and we do all of that, and yet it turns out that putting the reverse logistics systems in are very expensive. Right, there are many segments for which this really doesn't work. I mean, give us a sense. Does the closed loop approach, right, and a circular model for the way in which your equipment, is that covering 1% of HP's products? Is it covering 20%? Is it covering 50%? What roughly is the scale at which you're able to pull this off?
Well, I mean, I think...
if you can only do it at 10%, then nobody else can do it at more than 1.
When we look at specific product categories like printer cartridges, the percentages are much higher than 10%. We're able to bring in a large percentage of the ones that are returned to us. I mean, the big issue is recollecting them from the consumer. Right. And incentivizing them to get them back to us or from the customer. But once they come back to us, they're easily processed, and actually the cost of returning them, processing them, turning them into new cartridges is relatively competitive with the cost of making new ones from virgin material. So
it's not a lot more competitive.
No. But I mean, because of the other savings that occur in terms of not making the virgin materials, I mean, in plastics, the energy savings are on the order of 60% for many plastics. For metallic recycling, it's often in the 90s. So those types of savings also get factored into our assessment of it. So I think, to your point, absolutely. For something specific like printer cartridges, high value item, it actually pays to have that closed loop approach. E-waste is much more challenging because e-waste is not nearly as simple in terms of the materials that are coming back as printer cartridges. So we're dealing with multiple different plastics. We're often dealing with the materials that are made by either our competitors or even non-related companies. And so what we're finding actually, which is kind of interesting, is that it is a labor-intensive operation. And it actually lends itself, in many respects, to developing markets. So we've just opened a pilot facility in Mombasa, in Kenya, where we're partnering with a local NGO, Kamara Education, and we're setting up it's a labor-intensive process, take it apart, send it off to the grinders, the smelters, achieve the value in the materials, but it's also a source of green jobs in Mombasa. So maybe that's the model. Maybe this is not as easily done in developed markets as it is in developing markets, where in fact actually it's incredibly important as an alternative to burning. Many challenges in getting from, if you will, 5% circularity to 50%. Right, and I think the issue is really thinking outside the box for a big company like ours, and we're starting to do that.
I want to take the same issue with you at ESCOM, right? I can well believe that you're handing out 47 million, CFCs, right? Every utility on the planet, as far as I can tell, has been handing out millions of CFCs, most of which sit in people's, drawers. What are you really, really doing to change consumer behavior?
Well, I wear yellow shoelaces. No, in fact, it's part of a campaign that we have. It's called 49 Million.
Sorry.
And that is about getting all 49 million South Africans to change their attitude towards energy. Yes, compact fluorescent light bulbs, 47 million it's a big number. And in fact, it's not just a matter of handing them out, it's a matter of saying we'll do a swap. So you've got to bring your old incandescent in, and then we'll give you a CFL, and then we destroy the incandescents. And so I spoke about the role of technology as well as the role of behavior and values. And I think that that's where the true solution lies to a resource-efficient future. Yeah, you can only do so much with technology. If you don't change behavior, you are not going to have the solutions you need. And I think that definitely in South Africa, we've still got a long, long way to go to change that behavior and to change the appreciation that people need to have for energy, for water, for all of the resources around us, for the natural footprint that has to remain intact. And I think that we also need to engage in this quest for these sort of quantum leaps. You know, when I spoke about the transition in the power sector in South Africa, if we have a look at the true challenges of sustainability, that in itself is not enough. It's a huge challenge, and quite frankly, we're probably not going to get it right. We'll make mistakes as we go along the way, and we'll probably do some things very badly. Hopefully we'll do the most of it right. But it's a massive, massive challenge. And the only true way is to go for these sort of 90%, 99% improvements in efficiency, not, as Sam was saying, not the incremental improvements. But I'll come back to the point. Technology has a role, behavior and values have got an even bigger role.
So I just want to test, in addition to whether people are still awake out there. So a question, and I'd like a quick show of hands. Right? There's the classic economist view on what you need to do to change behavior, whether it's on energy, on water, or on you name it, right, is you need to push the prices up. We need to create markets, right? And we need to create markets which price in not just the immediate cost, but the externalities, right? Just a quick show of hands. How many people think that actually getting these prices right for resources is the single most important thing that can be done to address this challenge of delivering resource-efficient growth? So, can I ask just someone who didn't put their hand up, right, which is quite a lot of you out there, to describe what you think the alternative. I know there's no silver bullet to any of this, and I recognize that everything requires a package of different actions. But when I said it's price, and most of you didn't agree with that, despite the fact this is a B4E event, astonishingly, can people just give a quick view of the other things that they felt were the most important levers that could change consumer behavior? Yep, anyone? Someone in the audience.
Reward-driven web games.
One other comment, and then.
Oh gosh, this is loud, isn't it? I just think it's more complicated than that. If you take water, for example, you're actually dealing some way with something that's a human right. So where do you put pricing as the major changer of behavior in, say, water? I mean, I think it is much more complicated. I think you need to give people alternatives. I think there's a place for... Actually, some of the things that happened in Europe have not been so much about price. There has been a regulation that says you just can't do some things anymore. There has been information being given to consumers. So I think if you just put price on this whole range of other externalities, I think you're heading for a bad place, actually.
Very good. So that's exactly the conversation I wanted to generate. Now, Scott, you wanted to jump in.
Well, in agriculture right now, one of the things that is driving some innovation is cost of commodities. Corn, soybeans, those kind of things have gone up significantly. And producers are looking at ways to reduce those input costs at the same time. So it isn't, I mean, reducing carbon footprint and all that is part of it, but it's also economics. For example, you can use enzymes now. Some of the technologies we have now, you can reduce inputs or grains by a third. At the same. So by using something, improving overall digestibility, you can shrink your carbon footprint. Using amino acids or methionine, some of those things, you improve overall efficiency, so you improve growth. You reduce the amount of inputs you need. Same way with using various types of minerals, organic versus inorganic. If you're using organic over inorganic, you can reduce the amount of copper going out, not passing through the animal, going into the environment by up to 76%. So some of that is drivers right now, is the economics. But that can also have a flip side, because if the economics get to the point it's very costly, they may take the technologies out because they can't afford to put them in. So there's a balance between what the price is and the interest in putting in and utilizing some of these current technologies we have. Going forward, though, we need to start looking at other alternatives too. I mentioned the corn and soybeans or some of those, where we're doing work looking at cassava or some of the cassava peels or acacias or other things that are locally grown that's much more readily available on a local basis. So again, you cut down on you're using local resources, you're cutting down on the carbon footprint as far as moving products from various areas. So it's kind of a blend of price, and the desire to drive technology to be able to feed the world, and at the same time saving the planet. I mean, agriculture, I think, has been on the leading edge of trying to do that, because we realize that we have to become more efficient, and it can't be just total productivity. It has to be a complete balance of all of these aspects, or it's just not going to be sustainable. So again, price can drive it, but it can also have a negative at the same time.
So we're going to have one last round. Quick 1 minute or 30-second comment. Steve, can I start with you?
Yeah, price is a blunt instrument, and if you get your pricing wrong, which can be pushing up your costs or your price to a level where you start getting a response, then you're stressing other elements of society, and you're stressing the weakest parts of society, and often you'd end up with your unintended consequences. People actually move away from that service, for example, to a less sustainable service. And so I think that you've got to temper price then with social responsibility. Right. And a final point is that you made a point earlier on, is when you were talking to Alison, was this a CSI program? I think what we need to do is mainstream CSI into our decision making. You can't just make your decision on the basis of a financial bottom line. You need to now say, okay, fine, what is the benefits that you're going to see in society? What are the benefits that you're going to be seeing to the environment? And then put all of that into your decision making and make a decision.
So let me ask the panel one last kind of maybe unfair question, but it's my prerogative, so I'm going to use it. Over the last we're here at a COP, right? And there's been a tremendous emphasis in the last 5 years in particular on climate change, and some people would say that the focus on climate change has been entirely appropriate, because it is the risk multiplier of all risk multipliers with regard to anything to do with the environment. Other people would say that the emphasis on climate has actually distracted and taken appropriate, more balanced attention away from the broader set of environmental issues with which business needs to grapple as it looks to have a sustainable growth trajectory. Alison, has climate been has it been overemphasized, or have we got the balance right?
I don't know that it's been overemphasized as much as seen in a silo. I think from our perspective, climate change in many conversations is mutually exclusive than environmental health and resource productivity, but it's also exclusive of other development outcomes. And I think we need to look at this as a more comprehensive problem to come up with better solutions.
Steve?
I don't think we've got the balance right, but I think we can use climate change to get it right. You've got, the WBCSD has got something called Vision 2050, which is about true sustainability by 2050. And I think that there's a lot in the climate change space that is about awareness, sensitization, and actually action on the ground. I think we can build on that in achieving this true sustainability by 2050. Rio Plus 20 is next year, so let's use that as a launch pad.
Scott, we've got the balance right.
Well, climate has a huge impact on agriculture, always does, and always will. And as the climate changes, you need to be able to adapt to what you're going to produce or grow, dependent on what environmental conditions you're dealing with. And a lot of that is what's driven technology or innovation in agriculture because of those things over the years. So I think, it's a very important piece, but you have to, as I talk about, balance it between productivity, animal well-being, environment, climate change, and food safety. All of those have to go together. Right. So,
Chris.
Yes. Climate change is a critical issue facing society, but I think operating in the U.S. where climate change is denied by many people, it's forced us to look at sustainability and environmentalism in terms that the customer would see value in. And I think that's getting us to look at sustainability more broadly, and it's getting us to deliver sustainability in a way that drives economic benefit as well. And I think that's where the win-win is.
So when we started the work on resource productivity, there was a sense from the McKinsey community and many of our clients that we had put a huge amount of emphasis on the carbon. We had separately, by the way, done a work on water and on land use and on energy, but we had never somehow brought them together into an integrated, holistic approach. When we look at the change that's taking place in the global economy, I want you just to stop for one moment and consider the following statistic. That in today's world of what's going on in China, and I pick on China just as an example, there's 1 billion people whose GDP or economic consumption possibility is doubling, right, in roughly 7 years, right? When the UK had its industrial revolution, we had 10 million people, not 1 billion people, and it didn't take 7 years, right, to achieve a doubling of GDP. It took 70 years. So the scale and the speed of what is going on just in China is 1,000 times. 100 times the population and 10 times the speed. 1,000 times what the UK did in the Industrial Revolution. And by the way, it's roughly 300 times what the US managed at the peak of its Industrial Revolution. So these are astonishing, astonishing periods of economic transition. Our sense is that the climate issue matters as much as ever, right, in terms of, because the science is getting stronger, not weaker. But if we're going to address it, we're going to have to get there via the immediate issues that are of primary concern in the political environment, which is energy security, energy price volatility, access, not only for the 3 million in South Africa, but for the 1.4 billion globally who lack access to modern energy services, on food security, on material scarcity, which plays into the e-waste. We have got to find a way of meeting the real needs of consumers and citizens that also delivers against the goal of climate change. And if there was anything that I hope inspired us, it's the way that we heard your company tackling that integrated agenda, not starting with the middle class, but actually starting, if you will, at the bottom of the pyramid, and really, really meeting a set of needs that will transform lives in those communities. So please join me in showing your appreciation for the panel. Thank you.